It was the grout line that stopped me. Not the crack in the tile, not the water stain spreading across the ceiling of Unit 4B. The grout line, a thin, dark fracture running from the base of the shower wall up past the second row of ceramic, angled maybe 15 degrees off vertical, about 7 centimeters long, the kind of thing most people would caulk over on a Saturday afternoon and forget about by Monday. I set my flashlight down on the edge of the tub and pressed my thumbnail against it. The wall gave. Not much, maybe 2 millimeters, but it gave. Behind me, I could hear the building manager, a guy named Terrence, shuffling his feet in the hallway. He'd been shuffling for about 4 minutes. That's how long it had taken me to crouch down, pull the baseboard away from the wall, and find what I was looking for. "So we're good?" he said. Not a question, really, more like a sentence he needed me to finish for him. I didn't answer right away. I pressed the wall again, same give, same flex that shouldn't be there in a load-bearing partition 16 floors up. "My name is Brett Calloway. I'm a building envelope inspector. I work mostly residential high-rises in the Greater Toronto area. Waterproofing, cladding, thermal bridging, that kind of thing. I've been doing it for 11 years, since before my daughter Nora was born, since before my marriage ended, since before it was just the two of us in a 2-bedroom in Scarborough with a leaky window I kept patching with rope caulk every October because I hadn't gotten around to replacing the frame. I don't tell people their buildings are fine when they're not. That's the whole job, really. Anyone can tell you what you want to hear." "No," I said, "we're not good." Terrence made a sound in his throat. The building was called the Harrington, 42 stories, built in 2019, luxury condo tower in Yorkville, the kind of place where the lobby smells like a hotel and the concierge knows your coffee order. I'd been called in for a routine moisture assessment on the 14th and 16th floors after a few owners complained about humidity readings in their bathrooms. Routine. That was the word they'd used when they called my company. What I found in Unit 4B was not routine. The grout fracture was the surface symptom. What was underneath it, what I could feel through the wall cavity and confirm with the moisture meter I pulled from my bag, was a compromised waterproof membrane behind the entire wet wall assembly. Not a leak, not yet, but the membrane had debonded from the substrate in a section roughly 2 meters by 1.5. It was holding water like a slow reservoir, and the wall it was pressing against was a shared structural partition that ran continuous from the 4th floor to the 14th. I took photos, I wrote up my field notes. I told Terrence the unit needed to be vacated and the wall opened before anyone could determine the scope. He told me that wasn't going to work. I asked him why. He said because the owner of Units 4B, 4C, and the entire 14th floor penthouse was flying in from Vancouver that evening and had scheduled a private event for Friday night. 70 guests, catered. The building management company had already signed off on the common areas. "That's got nothing to do with my assessment," I said. "Brett, he said my name the way people say it when they think your name is the problem. I need you to understand what I'm telling you." I understood exactly what he was telling me. I drove back to the office, filed my preliminary report, and went to pick up Nora from her after-school program at Birchmount. She was 7 then. She had a worksheet about the water cycle that she wanted to show me before we even got to the car. I looked at it in the parking lot while the engine idled, and she explained each step to me with the patience of someone who assumed I needed help understanding precipitation. "It evaporates," she said, "and then it goes up and then it comes back down. It never actually leaves." "That's right," I said. "So the water in our tap was probably dinosaur water at some point." "Probably." "That's disgusting," she said very cheerfully and climbed into the back seat. I thought about that on the drive home. Water never leaving, just moving, finding new places to sit. I got the call at 8:47 that night. Nora was in bed. I was eating leftover butter chicken from a container standing at the kitchen counter, which is something I do more than I'd like to admit. The number was blocked, but the voice wasn't one I recognized. A woman, calm, unhurried, like someone who had never once been put on hold. She said her name was Claudette Moreau. I knew that name. Anyone in Toronto real estate or development knew that name. Claudette Moreau was the chair of Moreau Capital Group. They owned or had a stake in something like 40 commercial and residential properties across Ontario and Quebec. She was one of those people you see interviewed in Report on Business or on BNN Bloomberg, usually with the specific kind of composure that comes from never having had to wonder if a check was going to clear. She said she understood I had filed a preliminary inspection report on one of her properties that afternoon. I said that was correct. She said she'd like to meet and discuss it. I told her there wasn't really anything to discuss. The report was the report, and until the wall was opened and the membrane assessed by a registered engineer, the unit wasn't safe to occupy for a large event. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one. She was good at pauses. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I think it would be worth your time to hear what I have to say. I'll be at the Harrington at 9 tomorrow morning. I'd like 15 minutes. I thought about saying no. I thought about it for about 3 seconds, then I said fine. I didn't sleep well. Not because of the call, because of the wall. I kept running through the moisture readings in my head. The membrane debonding, the angle of the fracture relative to the load path from the floors above. 11 years of doing this, you start to feel structures the way some people feel weather. Something about that wet wall was sitting wrong with me. I got to the Harrington at 8:50. The lobby smelled like cedar and something floral I couldn't name. The concierge offered me a coffee without being asked. I said yes. Claudette Moreau arrived at 9 on the dot. She was maybe 60, maybe older, with silver hair cut close and a dark blazer over a cream turtleneck. She moved through the lobby like she'd designed it, which she possibly had. She shook my hand without a lot of ceremony, glanced at the coffee I was holding, and said, "Good. I hate waiting for people to caffeinate." We sat in a small meeting room off the main lobby. A woman I assumed was an assistant appeared and then vanished. Claudette set a leather portfolio on the table and didn't open it. "I read your preliminary report this morning," she said. "It was filed last night." "I know, tell me what you found. Not the report version, the version you'd tell your colleague." I looked at her for a moment. Then I told her, the grout fracture, the give in the wall, the moisture readings, 87% relative humidity in the cavity, well above the threshold, the debonded membrane, the fact that the wet wall sat directly adjacent to the structural partition and that partition was showing early indicators of water infiltration at the base. She listened without writing anything down and without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What's the risk if the event proceeds Friday? If the membrane fails suddenly and the water releases into the wall cavity at volume, which is unlikely in 48 hours, but not impossible, you've got a structural moisture event in a load-bearing partition. More likely, in the short term, you've got elevated humidity, potential mold activation in a space where 70 people are eating and drinking, and you've got the liability of having been told about it first." She nodded slowly. "What would it take to make this right, correctly, not cosmetically?" "Open the wall. Full membrane replacement. New waterproof system, probably a sheet-applied membrane with a proper drainage mat this time. Properly taped transitions at all penetrations. Flood test before close-up. You're looking at probably 3 weeks minimum, depending on what they find when they open it." She looked at me in a way that reminded me of my grade 11 physics teacher, the one who actually liked it when you gave him the complicated answer. "That's what I thought," she said. Then she opened the portfolio. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not a contract. Just a printed email chain between 2 people, one of whom was the building manager who had authorized the original construction inspection in 2019, and one of whom was the project's waterproofing subcontractor. The email at the top of the chain was dated 3 weeks before the building's occupancy permit was issued. I read it twice. The subcontractor was asking whether the membrane installation on floors 4 through 8 needed to be redone following a failed flood test. The manager's response, 4 words, was, "Just pass it along." I set the paper down. That email was forwarded to me this morning by someone who no longer works for that management company. Claudette said, "I purchased the Harrington 18 months ago from a development group. I did not build it. I inherited whatever was in the walls. You knew about this?" I knew there was something. I had suspicions about the 4th floor moisture readings from my own facilities team. When your report came in last night, I started pulling records. She paused. "I am not here to pressure you, Mr. Calloway. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because your report is correct and I need to know the scope of the problem before I can decide what to do about it." I looked at the email again. Just pass it along. How many floors? I said. That's what I need you to find out. She wasn't offering me money. She wasn't threatening me. She was handing me a document that could expose a systemic construction defect across multiple floors of a 42-story building and asking me to be the one who figured out how bad it was. The event Friday, I said. Cancelled. I called the catering company at 7 this morning. I sat back in my chair. Here's the thing about Claudette Moreau that I didn't expect. She wasn't interested in making the problem smaller. She was interested in knowing exactly how large it was. In my experience, that is a genuinely rare thing in this industry. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the people writing the checks are hoping you'll find a number they can live with. She wasn't looking for a number she could live with. She was looking for the truth, and she'd already started dismantling her own event before I'd agreed to anything. I told her I'd need to bring in a structural engineer for the partition assessment. I told her I wanted access to the maintenance records for the mechanical rooms on the affected floors. I told her the work authorization would have to go through my firm's standard contract, and that I wouldn't be reducing my scope to make the numbers more comfortable. She said, obviously. We shook hands again. The meeting was 40 minutes, not 15. Over the next 6 weeks, I led the building envelope assessment on floors 4 through 11. What we found confirmed the worst of it. The sheet-applied membrane had been installed over a damp substrate on multiple floors, meaning the adhesion bond was compromised from day one. The flood test had been failed and overridden. In 3 units on the 6th floor, we found active mold colonies behind the tile work. Stachybotrys, the bad kind, the kind that gets into building air. Those units were evacuated and remediated at Moreau Capital's expense before we'd even finished the full assessment scope. The management company from the original construction group faced regulatory complaints filed with Tarion, Ontario's new home warranty authority. The subcontractor lost their licensing to operate in the province. There was legal action. I gave a written statement. I don't know where it all ended up because by the time it was winding through the courts, I was already on to the next job. What I do know is that Claudette Moreau called me 8 months after that first meeting and asked if I'd be interested in leading envelope inspections on 4 of her other properties as part of a systematic review she was conducting. She said, and this is almost exactly what she said, I'd rather pay for the truth up front than the consequences later. I said I'd think about it. Then I said yes, because the work was good and the scope was honest, and those 2 things together are rarer than people think. The night I got that call, Nora was at the kitchen table doing a school project on bridges. She had a poster board and a ruler, and she was drawing the CN Tower on the wrong side of the page and didn't care. Dad, she said without looking up, what makes a bridge stay up? I pulled out a chair and sat down next to her. The load path, I said. You have to make sure the force goes somewhere. If it doesn't have anywhere to go, the structure fails. She looked at me over the top of her poster board. Like people? I didn't know what to say to that. She was 8 by then. I don't know where she gets it. Yeah, I said, kind of like people. She went back to drawing the CN Tower. I sat there for a while longer than I needed to. Outside, it was November, and the first real snow of the season was starting to come down, the wet, heavy kind that sticks to everything and makes the city quiet for about an hour before anyone starts complaining about it. I thought about that wall on the 4th floor. The grout fracture. The 2 millimeters of give, the way a building will tell you what's wrong with it if you're willing to press your hand against the right place and pay attention to what you feel. Some things you can caulk over, some things you have to open all the way up. I picked the second one, I always do. Nora's the reason for that, mostly. The reason I don't sign off on things I can't stand behind. She doesn't know that yet. Someday I'll tell her. For now, she's got a bridge to finish. I still think about that 2 millimeters of give. Not the mold we found on the 6th floor. Not the email chain, not the subcontractor's license being pulled, not any of the bigger things that came after. Just that first moment, my thumbnail against cold tile, and the wall moving when it shouldn't have. That small, wrong feeling that most people would have talked themselves out of. I've thought a lot about why I didn't talk myself out of it. Terrence was shuffling his feet in the hallway. There was money involved, a Friday event, 70 guests, a woman flying in from Vancouver, who owned half the buildings I'd ever worked in. Every signal in that room was telling me to write a number I could defend loosely and move on, and I've known guys who would have. Good guys, decent guys, guys who were tired and had rent due and told themselves it was probably fine. But here's what I've come to understand, and I don't think I could have articulated it back then the way I can now. The moment you override what you actually know to be true, you don't just compromise the job, you compromise the instrument. And the instrument, your ability to read a situation clearly, to trust your own hands and your own readings, is the only thing you actually bring to work. Once you start bending it to fit what someone else needs to hear, it doesn't bend back perfectly. It never quite does. Claudette Moreau understood something that most people in her position don't or won't. She understood that knowing the real size of a problem is always cheaper than finding out later. That took a kind of clear-headedness I genuinely respected, the willingness to cancel her own event, at cost, before she had any obligation to. That's not softness, that's precision. She saw the situation accurately, and she acted on what she saw, not on what would have been more convenient to believe. I think about Nora asking me what makes a bridge stay up. Load path, I told her. The force has to go somewhere, and I meant it structurally, because that's how I think. In materials and connections and transfer points. But she heard something else in it, because she's 8 and she's already smarter than I give her credit for. She heard that you can't just wish the force away. You have to design for it honestly, or eventually it finds its own path, usually through something you weren't expecting. That's what I was doing in Unit 4B, I think. I was finding the honest load path, not the one Terrence needed me to find, not the one that would have made Friday easier, the real one. I'm not telling you this because I think I did something extraordinary. I pressed a wall, I read a number, I wrote what I found. That's the job. What I am saying is that the job, done honestly, even when it costs something, has a way of compounding. Claudette called 8 months later. The work expanded. Nora's college fund looks a lot better than it did the year before. I don't think that's coincidence. I think it's just how things tend to work when you stop managing the truth and start reporting it. She's got a bridge to finish. I'm going to let her figure out the load path herself.